Blackshirts and Reds by Michael Parenti. Section: How many victims? We have heard much about the ruthless Reds, beginning with the reign of terror and repression perpetrated during the dictatorship of Joseph Stalin, 1929 to 53. Estimates of those who perished under Stalin's rule, based principally on speculations by writers who never reveal how they arrive at such figures, vary wildly. Thus, Roy Medvedev puts Stalin's victims at 5 to 7 million. Robert Conquest decided on 7 to 8 million. Olga Shatunovskaya claims 19.8 million just for the 1935 to 40 period. Stephen Cohen says 9 million by 1939, with 3 million executed or dying from mistreatment during the 1936 to 39 period. And Arthur Kessler tells us it was 20 to 25 million. More recently, William Rusher of the Claremont Institute refers to the, quote, 100 million people wantonly murdered by communist dictators since the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. End of quote. And Richard Laurie blames the Stalin era for, quote, the slaughter of millions. End quote. Unburdened by any documentation, these, quote, estimates invite us to conclude that the sum total of people incarcerated in the labor camps over a 22-year period, allowing for turnovers due to death and term expirations, would have constituted an astonishing portion of the Soviet population. The support and supervision of the Gulag, all the labor camps, labor colonies, and prisons of the Soviet system, would have been the USSR's single largest enterprise. In the absence of reliable evidence, we are fed anecdotes, such as the story Winston Churchill tells of the time he asked Stalin how many people died in the famine. According to Churchill, the Soviet leader responded by raising both his hands, a gesture that may have signified an unwillingness to broach the subject. But since Stalin happened to have 5 fingers on each hand, Churchill concluded, without benefit of a clarifying follow-up question, that Stalin was confessing to 10 million victims. Would the head of one state, especially the secretive Stalin, casually proffer such an admission to the head of another? To this day, Western writers treat this woolly tale as an ironclad confession of mass atrocities. Footnote: Stalin, quote, confided the figure of 10 million to Winston Churchill. Stephen Cohen, Bukharin and the Bolshevik Revolution. No doubt the famines that occurred during the years of Western invasion, counter-revolutionary intervention, White Guard civil war, and landowner resistance to collectivization took many victims. End of footnote. What we do know of Stalin's purges is that many victims were Communist Party officials, managers, military officers, and other strategically situated individuals whom the dictator saw fit to incarcerate or liquidate. In addition, whole categories of people whom Stalin considered of unreliable loyalty, Cossacks, Crimean Tatars, and ethnic Germans, were selected for internal deportation. Though they never saw the inside of a prison or labor camp, they were subjected to non-custodial resettlement in Central Asia and Siberia. To be sure, crimes of state were committed in communist countries, and many political prisoners were unjustly interned and even murdered. But the inflated numbers offered by Cold War scholars serve neither historical truth nor the cause of justice, but merely help to reinforce a knee-jerk fear and loathing of those terrible Reds. In 1993, for the first time, several historians gained access to previously secret Soviet police archives and were able to establish well-documented estimates of prison and labor camp populations. They found that the total population of the entire Gulag as of January 1939, near the end of the Great Purges, was 2,022,976. Footnote. By way of comparison, in 1995, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, in the United States there were 1.6 million in prison, 3 million on probation, 700,000 on parole, for a total of 5.3 million under correctional supervision. Some millions of others have served time, but are no longer connected to this custodial system in any way. End of footnote. At about that time, there began a purge of the purgers, including many intelligence and secret police and KVD officials, and members of the judiciary and other investigative committees, who were suddenly held responsible for their excesses of the terror, despite their protestations of fidelity to the regime. Soviet labor camps were not death camps like those the Nazis built across Europe. There was no systematic extermination of inmates, no gas chambers or crematoria to dispose of millions of bodies. Despite harsh conditions, the great majority of Gulag inmates survived and eventually returned to society when granted amnesty or when their terms were finished. In any given year, 20 to 40% of the inmates were released, according to archive records. Footnote by Getty, Victims of the Soviet Penal System. End of footnote. Oblivious to these facts, the Moscow correspondent of the New York Times in 1996 continues to describe the Gulag as, quote, the largest system of death camps in modern history, end quote. Almost 1 million Gulag prisoners were released during World War II to serve in the military. The archives reveal that more than half of all Gulag deaths for the 1934 to 53 period occurred during the war years, 1941 to 45, mostly from malnutrition, when severe privation was the common lot of the entire Soviet population. Some 22 million Soviet citizens perished in the war. In 1944, for instance, the labor camp death rate was 92 per 1,000. By 1953, with the post-war recovery, camp deaths had declined to 3 per 1,000. Should all Gulag inmates be considered innocent victims of Red repression? Contrary to what we have been led to believe, those arrested for political crimes, quote, counter-revolutionary offenses, numbered from 12 to 33% of the prison population, varying from year to year. The vast majority of inmates were charged with non-political offenses: murder, assault, theft, banditry, smuggling, swindling, and other violations punishable in any society. Total executions from 1921 to 53, a 33-year span inclusive, were 799,455. No breakdown of this figure was provided by the researchers. It includes those who were guilty of non-political capital crimes, as well as those who collaborated in the Western capitalist invasion and subsequent White Guard Army atrocities. It also includes some of the considerable numbers who collaborated with the Nazis during World War II, and probably German SS prisoners. In any case, the killings of political opponents were not in the millions or tens of millions, which is not to say that the actual number was either inconsequential or justifiable. The three historians who studied the heretofore secret Gulag records concluded that the number of victims were far less than usually claimed in the West. This finding is ridiculed by anti-communist liberal Adam Hochschild, who prefers to repeat Churchill's story about Stalin's figures. Like many others, Hochschild has no trouble accepting undocumented speculations about the Gulag, but much difficulty accepting the documented figures drawn from NKVD archives. End of section.